So here we are back at the board, and in this lesson what we're going to try to do is work our way back dilemma by dilemma to where we started, hopefully wiser and maybe with some answers. That'd be nice, right? But let's begin with dilemma number 8. Do we have souls? And we'll work our way down. Now, you probably aren't going to like the answer I'm going to give you here. If you want kind of a definitive proof, like yes, there's a soul, here's my proof, or no, there are no souls, here's my proof, I can't give you that. This is a more or less kind of answer. Actually, it's not even that. It's just really admitting that the trajectory of academics and intellectuals over the last few centuries, beginning, let's just say, with the period that we started in early modern philosophy to today, that has been a trajectory away from dualism. In the mind sciences, you don't find people who are, trying to figure out how the soul interacts with the body. You basically have people trying to figure out how mental states operate in a purely material, physical way. So that's the case in the mind sciences, and in philosophy you see the same thing. Only about a quarter of professional philosophers surveyed by Bourget and Chalmers still believe in dualism, and these are, with few exceptions, all theists who also believe in libertarian free will. So that is the general trend. That doesn't prove, of course, that souls don't exist, but it does sort of suggest at the difficulty of establishing something like dualism. In fact, it is so difficult that many people have simply abandoned the view. There are those exceptions, about 25% of professional philosophers who do believe in souls, but we might be able to motivate an argument against their position with something like the following. As mentioned in the sidebar in the person and the situation lesson, this might be motivated reasoning or a conclusion in search for premises. It might be the case that these thinkers who still believe in dualism and who are still professional philosophers, it might be the case that they basically self-selected into philosophy because they already held the belief in souls and other things, and they just found a discipline that allowed them basically to argue for what they already believed in. That's one problem with philosophy being completely open, in that you can basically explore whatever you want. So it turns out that there's sort of this constellation of views. I'm just going to call it the theist constellation of views. And they are the following: theism, belief in God; libertarianism, about free will; dualism; and moral realism, or moral objectivism. So it might be the case that, well, first of all, these views all fit together. If you believe in God, you sort of need libertarianism about free will to, try to ward off the problem of evil. Included with belief in God is belief in souls, right? Heaven and hell. You're going to go to heaven or hell depending on how you behave. And obviously moral realism is in there too, because, well, there are some morally right actions which you're supposed to do, and some things you're not supposed to do. Those are morally wrong. So these views all fit together, and it might be the case that some people already believed in these things, and they basically just found an opportunity in a discipline named philosophy to go in there and argue and defend these views. So that's one thing we might say about the people who still believe in dualism, but are professional philosophers. So maybe that's what's going on there. Who knows? In either case, what I want to say here is, well, we're definitely not going to solve this definitively here, but at least if I were to bet on it, I would not bet on dualism. I'll say that much. So there we say goodbye to dilemma number 8. Okay. Kant or the utilitarians, dilemma number 7. Well, to be honest, it is impossible for me to give you all the beautiful intricacies and delicacies that you can only really learn by going in depth into philosophical ethics. For that, I recommend my Phil 103 course, Ethics and Society. You really need a whole semester to just kind of flesh out what the state of philosophical ethics is today. And of course, and a very important aspect of that is this massive battle between the Kantians and the utilitarians. What can we say for now? Well, as of late, because of the state of philosophical ethics, basically because there's been no progress in philosophical ethics, many sciences are now diving into ethics. They're trying to basically fix up or make progress where the philosophers couldn't. And one of these disciplines that is doing this is neuroscience. Joshua Green here, the author of this book, is a neuroscientist. And what he basically has done is, well, he knew the relevant philosophy, he knew the relevant neuroscience, and what he did is he just shoved a bunch of people into fMRI machines, asked them moral dilemmas. He knew how people were going to answer, like he knew how a utilitarian would answer, and he knew how a Kantian would answer. And then, once the subjects inside the fMRI machine answered, he took note of which part of their brain was most active, and here is what he decided. Joshua Green, 2001, has used fMRI scanning to isolate the parts of the brain that are used for making utilitarian and Kantian type judgments. So he thinks he's figured out what parts of the brain are responsible for these types of judgments. By the way, the Kantian judgments, the things that are basically rule-oriented, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, those actually come from the more emotional parts of the brain. Utilitarian calculations, which are literally calculations, trying to see which action will maximize happiness for all beings involved, that is the evolutionarily newer, more rational faculties, according to Joshua Green. And, well, here is what he says. He argues that he has debunked the theories, arguing instead that, although neither is strictly speaking true, we are better off being consequentialists. Now, there is controversy to everything Joshua Green is doing. I mean, I think it's really cool, but I do recommend this book. Check it out for yourself. Maybe the most controversial thing that he's saying here is that we're better off being consequentialists. So just to be clear, he's saying they're both technically wrong. So I bet you weren't expecting that one. Is it Kantianism or utilitarianism? Neither is the answer, according to Joshua Green. However, he says, well, you do want to use the newer parts of the brain to make your decisions as opposed to the older emotional parts of the brain. So he actually says, but in the end, if you're going to be something, be a consequentialist. So that is the oh-so-controversial work of Joshua Green. Pretty cool, though. That's about as far as we can take this debate in this class. Goodbye, Mill, and goodbye, Kant. Okay, is morality relative? Well, remember that in this class we covered classical cultural relativism, and an interesting thing about classical cultural relativism is that it makes a very strong empirical claim. It says differences in value do not seem to rest on disagreement about the facts. In fact, here is my slide that I used many moons ago when teaching classical cultural relativism. So I'll read it over. The main argument is there are major differences in the moralities that people accept, and these differences do not seem to rest on actual differences in situation or disagreements about the facts. So, for example, in Peru, it is customary to, as a delicacy, on special events, you eat cuy, which is guinea pig, which is pictured. I've actually enjoyed cuy. It's okay. Once you get past the whole, the way they serve it to you, it's actually tasty. In any case, here is what a classical cultural relativist might say. whether you're an American, and Americans tend to not eat guinea pigs, or you're a Peruvian person, you don't disagree on the facts, right? So guinea pigs have a certain weight, they have a certain length. Whatever empirical facts you want to throw out there, Peruvians and Americans will agree, says the cultural relativist. Where they disagree is on the moral claim, and only on the moral claim of whether or not it's okay to eat them. So that is a view that the relativists hold, and it is an empirical claim, meaning that when you see differences in value, you won't see a difference it isn't rooted in a disagreement about the facts. So with that said, here's some trouble for the classical cultural relativists. Cultures with very different accepted codes of conduct routinely disagree on the facts. For example, now, I've chosen examples that, because I don't have all day to spend on this, I've chosen examples that are racy and they're going to upset you a little bit. And good, because this is a real problem with classical cultural relativism and we need to point it out. So, in the past, think about, early 20th century America, where men were, I don't want to say allowed, but routinely were extremely condescending to women. I'm not saying things are perfect now, but if you watch, shows like Mad Men and anything set before the 60s, basically, and if it's somewhat accurate, the condescension towards women was appalling. I mean, just extremely upsetting, and it makes you uncomfortable, and that's the way it was. So we can consider that a whole other accepted code of conduct. It was, what would a relativist say? It was acceptable for men to behave in that way in those days. Well, if you accept that, there has been disagreement on the competence of women. Opponents of women's suffrage commonly argued married women did not need the vote because they would be best represented by their husbands. What does this mean? It means that the reason why men felt okay with being so condescending and basically denying them the right to vote, right, is because they did not think that women were cognitively capable of representing their own best interests. That is an empirical claim. That is something that we disagree with them about now. Men from the early 20th century didn't think that women had comparable cognitive capacities, and now we think that's not true. So what's going on here is there is a disagreement on values, on how you can treat women, and it was rooted in a disagreement about a fact or an empirical question, whether or not women had the cognitive capacity to represent their own best interests. So that goes perfectly counter to what the relativists were saying. Let me give you another example. Lynn Hunt argues that the notion of human rights was invented in the 18th century, a notion that seemed to apply to all propertied men, and even to propertyless men, children, and the insane, since they might one day acquire reason and moral autonomy. So it was documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of the Rights of Man in France that gave birth to the notion of human rights. Now, you see earlier kind of mentions of human rights, but the language and the explicit codification really came in the 17th century, as Lynn Hunt argues, but it wasn't applied to women. That is clearly a moral claim, moral rights, literally human rights, apply to men, children, and the insane, but not to women. And here is what Lynn Hunt says. Women alone seemed not to have any of these options. They were defined as inherently dependent on either their fathers or husbands. If the proponents of universal, equal, and natural human rights automatically excluded some categories of people, it was primarily because they viewed them as less than fully capable of moral autonomy. Again, a moral conclusion, women don't get these rights, comes from or is rooted in an empirical claim that turns out to be false, that women don't have the cognitive capacity to be capable of moral autonomy, to be able to deliberate on moral matters. That, again, goes against the relativist claim. 2 and O here, or sorry, O and 2. I got one more because I like the history of computation, and when I saw this, I kind of had my jaw was just wide open. Up until the dawn of digital computers, the task of computation was given to humans, mostly women. So computers was actually a job title, and you would compute things. And mostly women held the job. Okay, but here's the shocking part from the slides. It was thought that not only did women have better eyes than men, but they were less likely to be distracted by thinking while counting. Men are going to think, so they'll get distracted and they won't count right. But women don't think, so they can count. I don't even know how to, that's literally the perception of what female cognition was like was so radically different and wrong that we have to stand in awe at this. And that's why women were basically given, there was no moral imperative to treat women with respect. And in large part, it was rooted in empirical claims that were false about the cognitive capacities of women. This clearly shows the relativists were wrong. In short, there might be some practices where there is no disagreement on the facts, for example, the eating of guinea pig, but there have clearly been various moral codes where some cultures, past and present, got the facts wrong. Men, among many reasons for why they treated women so poorly, in those days, at least part of it was because they got the facts wrong. They had views about female cognition that were wrong. Okay, so that's one thing I want to say about classical cultural relativism. I might add that, so, this slide is the one where I present the relativistic notion of truth. So a moral judgment can be true for some culture. This is attacked too. There are many aspects of cultural relativism that are attacked mercilessly, basically. To many teachers, classical cultural relativism is kind of a lesson that you present this ethical theory mostly as a punching bag so you can show how bad it is. I'm not going to go into that here. I will have some resources for you if you want them. But there is so much wrong with this view that it's hard to summarize it all in one little lesson. So let me close with this on classical cultural relativism. I know that it kind of started as a way of seeing other cultures in a more accepting way and all that. However, maybe paradoxically, it's also a dangerous view if you fetishize culture a little too much. So I have here a somewhat controversial claim by Steven Pinker. So I'll show you the quote in a second. I might add that this quote describes violence against women. If you don't want to hear that, I would skip ahead 15 seconds. And okay, you can do that now. If only one person in the world held down a terrified, struggling, screaming little girl, cut off her genitals with a septic blade, and sewed her back up, leaving only a tiny hole for urine and menstrual flow, the only question would be how severely that person should be punished, and whether the death penalty would be a sufficiently severe sanction. But when millions of people do this, instead of the enormity of being magnified a millionfold, suddenly it becomes culture, and thereby magically becomes less rather than more horrible, and is even defended by some Western moral thinkers, including feminists. So what's going on here is that if we treat culture in such a sacred way, such that, whatever they do is okay for them, you're actually advocating things that are morally abhorrent, that are worse than not being accepting of all cultures, in the way that some cultural relativists might have been in their heart to do something like that. So this view is now dangerous, at least Pinker says, because some cultures really do harm people, and maybe that's not okay. All right. Well, at this point, maybe it's becoming somewhat clear that ethics is in trouble. The two major theories, Kantianism and utilitarianism, they each get about a third of professional philosophers subscribing to them. So those are the two dominant ones. The relativists are, they're basically negligible. There's very few of them. But in any case, that they're kind of, mired in debate. They are. There's not much progress there, and this gets pointed out by people like Nick Bostrom. So let me take this from the slide. Nick Bostrom argues that since there is no ethical theory or meta-ethical position that holds a majority position, that means that most philosophers subscribe to an ethical theory that is false. Now just think about this for a second. About a third of philosophers are Kantian, okay? So let's pretend that they're right. It turns out, Kantianism is true. That means that 67% of other philosophers were technically wrong, right? If I were to give a test where 60% of the students were to fail, I would think there's something wrong with the test, right? So this shows you that at the best case scenario, one where at least one theory is true in philosophical ethics, that shows that the field is in systematic error. Most people are wrong with regards to their ethical positions. So that's pretty bad. Philosophical ethics is a mess, as my way of summarizing that. It's so bad, in fact, that there's been kind of a newer movement of people they're called moral skeptics, but there's flavors of them. So one flavor is called moral error theory. And let me talk about them for a second. From the slides, some moral error theorists, for example, Gardner and Joyce, are arguing that the whole idea of moral values, whether they be relativist or absolutist or whatever, is no longer tenable or even useful. So what they're suggesting here, what I kind of like to analogize them to, is they're like atheists about morality. And just like some atheists, they might say, yeah, religion was useful at a certain point in our history, but now we have legal codes and institutions that protect people way better than religion could have. So now religion just gets in the way. That's what the moral error theorists, at least these moral error theorists, are saying about morality. Maybe it was useful at some point, but we made it up, number one, and number two, it's no longer useful. So that's how messy philosophical ethics is. Some people are saying, close this whole branch down. Nothing useful is being done here. That is a mess. Go take Phil 103. That's a fun class. So, all right, that's about it. All that to say is that relativism is not a very good theory. Goodbye. Okay. Well, we began the whole ethics, survey of the field of ethics with this dilemma right here. But this dilemma has both an element of ethics involved as well as like human nature. So dilemma number 5 is, do we only act from self-interest? Now, our poster child for this was Thomas Hobbes and or Walter White here pictured. The idea here is, though, that Hobbes used this to kind of ground his ethical theory, but we also have to just cover the question itself. Do humans only act from self-interest? Now, I said way back when that this is actually an empirical question, not really a philosophical one. And, well, it is the 21st century. Let's look at what the data shows. Now, let me get rid of that. There is a lot of data on this. I'm only selecting a couple of fields that have anything to say on this because I would spend all day on this otherwise. But many different disciplines, empirical disciplines, sciences, are looking into this, and it does not look good for psychological egoism. Now, just remember, psychological egoism is the view that all actions are rooted in self-interest. So, is it the case that humans only behave in that self-interested way? Well, let's begin with sociologist Randall Collins. Collins makes the case that if people acted on a purely rational basis, they would never have gotten together to form society. So the reason why he calls it purely rational basis is because now psychological egoism is referred to as rational choice theory. And Collins, along with many evolutionary game theorists and other people, which we'll cover in a second, is saying if this really was the way humans operated, we would have never scaled society up to the degree of complexity that we enjoy today. A society of our scale simply needs humans to occasionally, at least, act for the sake of the group as opposed to just for themselves. So purely self-interested people would never give rise to society like ours. Even if we're mostly self-interested, we're not always self-interested, is the point that Randall Collins is making. And we need to be group-oriented at least sometimes for society to take, the kind of society that we have to come about. So that's Collins' view. Now that's sociology. Again, it has some backing from evolutionary game theory too, but we're just covering Collins here. Here is, Tomasello is everything. He's a developmental psychologist, anthropologist, and linguist. So kudos to him, I guess. But here's from his book, A Natural History of Human Thinking, his conclusion there. Tomasello makes the case that if we were purely driven only by self-interest, then the human language faculty could not have evolved the way that it did. So it turns out if you teach other primates like sign language, like if you teach a gorilla sign language, most of what they do is commands. Humans are different. It turns out that we are very prone to giving each other information, and sometimes that information is for the benefit of others. So that's kind of what the human faculty evolved to do, to give information. That's also why we work so well together. And according to Tomasello, had our motivational system only been self-interested, we would have never had the psychological capacity to develop the capacity for language that we currently have. It just is the case that self-interest alone could have never produced our type of language faculty. Our type of language faculty is sometimes for the benefit of others, right? So we give information to others, helpful information. So according to this linguist / a bunch of other things, that's just not how our human motivational system works. It's not pure self-interest. Now, we might sometimes be self-interested, maybe even most of the time, but not always. That's the important point again. And one more. This one from social psychologist Daniel Batson. Now, I actually love Batson's work. And if you are interested in this question of psychological egoism, I would start here, actually. But in any case, lastly, Batson spent several decades testing subjects for altruistic and egoistic motivation. And he goes over all his experiments, the most important ones in this book here, kind of a memoir kind of book. The result, the view that we are purely driven from self-interest is false. Now, again, maybe most of the time we are self-interested, but not always, not always. Now, Batson has an interesting little, psychological explanation for this. At the end of his book, he even cites like Paradise Lost and things. But he says, maybe it was our need to have a simple explanation that drove the belief in psychological egoism. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if our motivational system basically had just like one equation, one function in it, right? Just maximize self-interest. That would have been such a nice, neat story. It would have been simple. We wouldn't have to think too much. But he says that's just not how we are. And the fact that this, our motivational system is complicated, it's not attractive to us. We wish it were simple so we can just say, okay, we solved that problem, we're done. But instead, we have to leave what he calls the Eden of egoism, the simple explanation, and we have to go out and find more complicated explanations for how our motivational system works. So that's Batson's kind of little closing comments, but there you go. Now, some disciplines still work under the rational choice paradigm, psychological egoism, like economics. But people are attacking them now too. So we kind of live in an interesting time, maybe a time of transition against this psychological egoism view. In any case, well, we solved that one at least. At least I think we did. So goodbye, Heisenberg. Okay. This is the one you've been waiting for. I know. Do we have free will? Again, I'm not going to answer this in any satisfactory way. I will say this. At least some people are still holding out hope for libertarian free will. Mark Gallagher is one of those people. So some, like Gallagher, thinks it's an open question. Maybe we have libertarian free will. I might add that Gallagher, he's very cautious. He basically says, well, maybe most of our choices are determined, but at least some of them maybe are not. So no matter what, no one's taking a hardcore libertarian position anymore. Not that I'm aware of, because it's such a hard view to defend that that people are kind of backing up from it. I might add that some people, like Michael Gazzaniga, are basically saying, yeah, it's basically over. So let me read this from the slides. Others, like Michael Gazzaniga, think the 17th century concept of free will doesn't survive the findings of the mind sciences. He thinks we have, at best, a very mitigated free will. So Gazzaniga is a neuroscientist. So is Ramachandra, another person who has something to say on this. And they basically believe that maybe we have a free won't. So we don't have free will. We can't choose what to do. But apparently we can say no. We have a free won't. I won't do that. So that's what we're referring to here as mitigated free will. You aren't free to do anything, but you can say no to some things. So I guess, there's a silver lining there. Even with that said, I think there's something more to be said here. So some thinkers that agree with Gazzaniga think that to continue to think we are as free as Descartes thought we were is not only unscientific, but even politically dangerous. Now, Harari is an interesting thinker, and I agree with some of what he says. I disagree with some of it, but here is something that, anyone that's thought about this long enough knows is a problem. If you really do think like Descartes thought thought, and some people today think, no, I'm completely rational. I make my own choices. If you don't think you can be hacked in any way, if you don't think the environment has an effect on your decisions, if you really have this completely outdated view on free will, then you're in trouble. I mean, we're in trouble because of you. So I don't have to tell you that the democratic system here in the United States is in turmoil. It's reeling, and it has something to do with social media. And social media has the capacity to affect people's opinions in a non-truth tracking way. It's sometimes totally not true. What social media might get you to believe. So I do have a reference here to kind of point you in. Let me read this from the slides. Social media might be one of the most disruptive technologies of the new digital age. So that's from Lanier. So, let me summarize this real quick. I think you should check out this book, but let me summarize this. Well, these platforms are designed to be as addictive as humanly possible. The content that is provided for you is tailored to get you to stay on there as long as possible. Data is collected on you basically the entire time that you're on there. And then once they figure out what kind of user you are, they lump you into some categories, and they figure out which types of advertising work the best on you. So now competitive firms like, corporations, companies, politicians, whatever, they then basically buy the privilege of directly not only engineering ads specifically for you or your group, the kind of person that you are, but they even deliver them to you at the exact moment when you are most susceptible to that, right? So This is kind of what's, disrupting well, not only, our buying habits, but also our political habits, our voting trends, and our voting preferences. So this is bad. And part of the reason for this might be that people think they're invulnerable to this kind of thing. They think, no, I have free will. I'm fully rational. I make my own decisions. The truth is, you don't. And if you keep thinking that way, well, you're probably the most vulnerable to being manipulated by these platforms whose their whole profit motive is behavior modification. So this is, maybe the idea of free will is dangerous. In any case, do we have libertarian free will? Oh, I hate to say this out loud, but I wouldn't bet on it. But in any case, here we say goodbye to this dilemma. Okay, so down there we have some possible solutions, but that's not a dilemma, so let's get rid of all this stuff. Okay, does God exist? Ooh, well, here we go, sensitive topic. Let me begin by saying this. When I first introduced the philosophy of religion, I said there's deductive arguments for and against God's existence and inductive arguments. I think I said it in a footnote, but the point is that the way for arguing for and against God's existence used to be purely deductive. You would come up with an argument. Here's my argument against God's existence, and it would be just a deductive argument. Now people are telling, they're basically giving explanations of with regards to religious belief that are inductive. They say, well, what's more likely, that God exists or that this story that I told is true? So those are the inductive, what I'm calling the inductive approaches. And I'll just cover a couple of them. They are interesting. So Robert Wright is one of these people. Robert Wright, 2009, reconstructs how the idea of a God was born and slowly evolved into the notion of an all-powerful single God through a reconstruction of the historical events that caused it. So for Robert Wright, the explanation behind religion is an idea. At some point, we developed the idea of a God, and he literally, through the surviving documents that exist, documentary evidence, he just kind of shows you how that idea slowly morphed into the monotheistic conception of God. So, on his view, God doesn't exist. It's an idea that we made up, and it slowly built up into what we now conceive of as God. So that's his argument. I really also like the work of Pascal Boyer on this. Boyer argues that religious belief is a byproduct of several of our basic cognitive modules, like our agency detection module, our capacity to detect personhood, and our personal file system, our ability to keep track of different individuals in our lives. So our agency detection module is basically, all right, so right now I'm looking at a speaker, and I know that the speaker isn't a person, right? But when I look at, my cousin, I know that he is a person. So that's my capacity to detect agency. I can tell persons from non-persons. Our personal file system is also a basic cognitive capacity of ours. We have like a Rolodex in our minds, right? With people's names and memories of them and pictures, basically like mental representations of them. And that's important to keep track of so that we can navigate through the social world. So these are psychological capacities that we have because we need them. And Boyer says maybe these are what explain why people believe in God and souls and ghosts and that kind of stuff. So our personal file module, along with some other modules that he explains, leads to the belief in ghosts, since our personal file for a relative or friend is still active even after they've died. So you have, your personal file for, Bob, whatever. And at a certain point, Bob dies. Very sad. But Bob is dead. However, there is no box in your personal file system that allows you to delete, right? Bob's memory, Bob's file stays in your mind. And so it feels like they're still around somehow. And then how do you explain that feeling? Well, you say, well, they're still around somewhere. Maybe they're in a better place or something like that. The idea here is that this kind of lingering feeling that they're still around, that's what makes you believe in ghosts or souls, and the idea that they're still around in heaven or maybe in hell. Who knows? Who knows what kind of a person Bob was? But in any case, it's just this personal thought system that makes you believe in this kind of stuff. That's a very interesting view. He goes further. Our agency detection module might be overactive, and so we misattribute agency to nature and or the universe itself. So Boyer basically says, yeah, you sometimes you look at trees and the wind blows and the tree moves and you think there's something there. So you misattribute agency. There's nothing there. I mean, there is something there, but it isn't person. So Boyer says we obviously need to detect or to differentiate persons from non-persons. So we need the psychological capacity, but we over-project sometimes. So we know this happened with rain. We know that people believed in rain gods. We also know that people believed in sun gods. And what if this idea just kept snowballing and getting bigger and bigger? I mean, there was even a wine god, right? So people were like, oh, there's definitely a wine god. Why else would wine have this effect on us? Someone made it have this effect on us. So it kept ballooning, this idea. And eventually the gods got put together and made super powerful and all-knowing and all-loving. Basically, eventually, you get an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God. So that kind of jives with Robert Wright's version of this story. And who knows? I mean, it's an interesting theory. So these are inductive arguments against God's existence. I have one more for you here from Kyle Harper. I like some of his work. So here's what he says. Some theorists believe that the success of some religions is accidental. For example, Harper discusses the role that epidemic disease played in the rise of Christianity and Islam. Now, I won't cover Islam here, but I will cover some Christianity. Why not? Harper reminds us that although this is forgotten today, these are eschatological or apocalyptic religions. And it is true, by the way. Early Christians, they literally didn't even think there was time to, change your behavior. They would go out into the deserts and await the second coming. So they really were apocalyptic religions. We forget that now because the second coming didn't happen or hasn't happened or whatever. So they are apocalyptic religions, and in the midst of a plague, for example, like the Antonine Plague, it seemed like the end of times. And this added credibility to the early Christians' religious claims. Imagine that a quarter of the people around you died. That would certainly seem like the end of the world. And so the Christians, they just seemed more credible. Maybe there is a second coming. Maybe we are about to get to Judgment Day. And so this played a role in the recruitment of Christians. Moreover, basic care, for example, feeding and cleaning, made it more likely that an infected person would survive. This is, of course, exactly what Christian ethics prescribes that we do of others. So people would flock to the churches for this reason. Notice what's going on here. If you were a Christian, you were more likely to survive because Christian ethics means that they should, feed and clean you and that kind of stuff. So you're more likely to survive. So afterwards, the population, Christians are going to be more represented. Moreover, if you were to go to a Christian church during the epidemic and you survived, even if you weren't Christian before, you're definitely more likely to be a Christian afterwards because literally Christians saved you. So this is what, at least in part, led to the rise in numbers of Christians. So says Harper, at least. In any case, do I really have any definitive proof for or against God's existence? The truth is, no. But we do have some newer, interesting, inductive arguments against God's existence, basically debunking all religions, not only Christianity. And that's where I want to leave this one off. Okay. Empiricism or rationalism? Well, let's start with good old John Locke. If you recall, one of his views is that we are born with a blank slate. Now, unfortunately for Mr. Locke, he is wrong, very wrong, maybe. With regards to Locke, in his 2003 The Blank Slate, Steven Pinker dispels the commonly held view that we are born with a blank slate. We, in fact, have several mental mechanisms built into us by evolution, such as a language acquisition device and an intuitive physics. So, it definitely is the case that we learn language too fast for it to be for us to be born completely with a blank slate. There must be something in us that facilitates the acquisition of language, which means we're not born with a blank slate. Also, it looks like we have a basic understanding of how physics works, how objects work, how an object can't go through a wall, how two objects can't be in the same space, right? So it looks like even babies have this, which means they're born with it. So we're born with some of these ideas already in our head, in our minds, I should say. Some thinkers, like Richard Joyce, argue that we have an innate morality module that was programmed into us so that we can coordinate our behavior with each other, inform each other about who's a good, say, foraging partner, and form more cohesive groups through shared norms and practices. So Joyce says, because morality, basically every culture has a moral code, there must be something in our minds programmed by evolution that gives rise to moral codes. So that's not cultural relativism. Joyce is a moral error theorist. He denies that morality is real in any objective sense. But he says we make it up. We have this morality module that helps us make it up. So, interesting view. So, in any case, if he's right, or even nearby right, Locke is again wrong. We aren't born with a blank slate. I have one more, my absolute favorite. We also have an innate number sense. So I'm actually more confident about this one than that of Richard Joyce. It really does look like we have this, well, I'll give you a quote by Dehaney, but it looks like our facility with numbers is just too impressive for us to be completely a blank slate. So here is a nice quote from Dehaney, and a nice GIF while we're at it. A quantitative representation inherited from our evolutionary past underlies our intuitive understanding of numbers. If we did not already possess some internal non-verbal representation of the quantity 8, we would probably be unable to attribute a meaning to the digit 8. We would then be reduced to purely formal manipulations of digital symbols in exactly the same way that a computer follows an algorithm without ever understanding its meaning. So if that sounds a little bit like the Chinese room, that's what he's saying. It looks like we already had the meaning of some numbers in our minds, and we built up on those, because otherwise we would just be manipulating digits without having any understanding of what they mean. So we must already have the meaning somehow built into us from our evolutionary past, which means we're not born with a blank slate. So much for Locke's blank slate. Here's some food for thought, though, and this is your last food for thought. Famously, David Hume thought that Locke's preferred type of reasoning, induction, was unjustified. The basic idea behind induction is that what has happened in the past will likely happen again. For example, if copper dissolved in nitric acid today, then it will likely do the same again tomorrow. This is called the principle of uniformity. Basically, for induction to work, you need to more or less believe that what happened in the past will continue happening again, right? Nature is uniform. It tends to behave in the same way time and time again. But you only believe that because in the past, what happened in the past happened again. If you need to pause to read that over again, please do. The general idea here is, why would you believe in the principle of uniformity? Or Why would you believe that what happened in the past will happen again? Well, you believe that because in the past, what happened in the past happened again. What does that mean? Well, Hume says the only justification for induction appears to be more induction, which is fallacious circular reasoning. This is basically the inductive version of the regress argument. And that's no good for Locke. That is his preferred method of reasoning, and he apparently can't defend it without being circular. No good for John Locke. Bad for the blank slate. Bad for induction. I wonder, do any of Locke's views survive today? Well, here is your very last sidebar. Here we go. It's even the case that Locke's views on how we represent the world are most likely false. Locke believed that our sense impressions of the outside world very likely actually resemble the outside world. Remember, he acknowledged that we could never verify that our ideas of the world match the world itself, but he says they pretty much are the same, and that's why otherwise we wouldn't survive. We basically need them to more or less match the outside world, otherwise we die. We can be reasonably sure that the world is somewhat close to the way our senses interpret it. But Kant famously disagreed with him, saying, among other things, that we can never know the world as it really is with our senses alone, but that we must use reason. So Kant had his transcendental realm, and he basically said, yeah, you will never know it. Our senses don't resemble it. He's wrong. That's what Kant said. Well, let me add one other bit on Kant here. Also of note, Kant argued that time and space do not exist independently of human sensibility. So he called time and space forms of intuition. Now what's crazy about Kant, and we'll talk more about him next time, but he believed that time and space were not real. Right? And it sounds crazy, but Kant was right and Locke was wrong. Your senses do not at all represent reality as it is. They only track what is fitness enhancing. Now, I can't get into this, obviously, but you know that your eyes don't see reality as it really is. If it did, you would see atoms and all kinds of other things, but you don't see any of that. But it's actually worse than that. So to figure out why, you should check out Donald Hoffman's book on this. But really, we don't see reality at all the way it is. That would be extremely maladaptive. It's actually, we only see what we need. Maybe put more crudely, you didn't evolve to see reality as it is. You evolved to eat reality, or figure out what is edible and other things that you need for survival. I'm sure you can imagine which ones I'm talking about. In any case, so Locke was wrong about that, and surprisingly, to me at least, the future of physics is one in which space-time is not a feature of the fundamental equations of physics. Now, this is theoretical physics, right? And it's slightly controversial. But Rovelli, at least one theoretical physicist, says, yeah, space-time, not objectively real. So you can check out that book if it is interesting to you. By the way, this is a good introductory book to this quantum loop theory, quantum gravity. Very, very interesting. It's readable. It's not too technical. It's good stuff. So, okay. Anyway, so Kant was sort of right. He didn't mean it this way, of course, so we can't give him a ton of credit. But it's kind of weird to me. Okay, in sum, Locke's empiricism has many empirical problems. That is somewhat ironic, right? But yeah, Locke's empiricism, not going to survive this class. Question, does rationalism fare any better? Well, to answer that, let's remind ourselves that rationalism is a view that through the use of reason, you can basically give or secure a God's eye view of the world. You can have a model of the world that you can have complete certainty in. Well, that is a very tall order for what human reason can do. Are you confident that human reason has that much power to give you a perfect model of how reality is? Highly unlikely. What did reason evolve for anyway? Well, here is one theory. According to some theorists, Mercier and Sperber are one example. It appears that the evolutionary origin of our capacity to reason has a social origin. It helped us to win arguments. Basically, during much of our evolutionary history, if we were without a tribe, we were going to die. So why did reason evolve? We needed to defend our actions and our words. If you were able to, let's just say you got in trouble with someone, and you were able to kind of finesse it, massage the problem with your words, with your arguments, you could stay in the tribe, which means you wouldn't die, which means you would reproduce. And your little capacity to make arguments got passed down to your offspring. And obviously those who weren't any good at defending their views or defending their actions or whatever, they didn't pass off their offspring because they got kicked out of the tribe and died. So that's their theory. Now it's way more complicated than that, but you can check out that book if you want to. This leads unaided reason to usually simply confirm our pre-existing beliefs. In other words, confirmation bias. So this links all the way back to lesson 1. Why do we have confirmation bias? Well, part of it is that our capacity to reason literally evolved primarily to just defend our actions and our views. Basically, obviously, what we already believed. Why else would we have done it or said it if we don't believe in it? So that's why we have confirmation bias. That's what reason is for, basically, defending your views. So that's one theory as to how reason evolved. Notice that's not what the rationalist thought reason was for. Let me give you just one more theory. We've already mentioned Thomas Hello, but he has a similar view, well, somewhat similar. There are other theories about the function of our capacity to reason, but most of these theories also stress the social function of reason, not the intellectual function of reason. So Thomas Hello gives his version, which I won't state here, but it's still a social role. Reason is for talking to others. It isn't for coming up with a God's eye model of the world. That's not what reason evolved for. In short, if I can put it in a nutshell, reason doesn't do what the rationalists thought it did. That is not good for the rationalists. So much like our debate between the Kantians and the utilitarians, but maybe even more so with this one. If we take Locke as a representative of empiricism and the rationalists just kind of in general, their focus on rationality, if we take those two opposing camps with Locke on one side and the rationalists on the other, they're probably both wrong. As a matter of fact, I'm relatively confident in saying that both are wrong. So that is how that story ends right there. What's left? Descartes and Francis Bacon. Well, Bacon, we've never really, taken his views very seriously in this class. Not because he's wrong, but because given the time period that we were studying, it wasn't the most popular view. So all that's left is Descartes. So, are you ready? Are you pumped?